But the dimension I want to discuss with you first right now for the time being, also because of personal things that I'm going through, and I think that we all are, our generation is just the simplest level, right? Jacob left his father in Beersheba and he went to Haran. He left his mother and father behind and he went to Haran. Now, the sages share a teaching that is really universally accepted because it's deduced from the timeline of Jacob's life, right? The sages have mapped out all of Jewish history year for year and just do the math, that there are 14 years that transpired between his departure from his father's home to his arrival in Haran. And what happened during those years? Anyone know? I'm looking at the comments, seeing if anyone knows. Okay, he was studying in the yeshiva, in the house of study of Shem and Ever. Shem and Ever. Now, this is a very well-known institution which, although it was established before the giving of the Torah, right? What are they studying in yeshiva if it was before the giving of the Torah? They still studied and deeply immersed themselves into understanding and serving the God of Israel, right? There was a tremendous understanding of God before the Torah. There was Malchi Tzedek, right? He was the priest of God, the Most High. There was Shem and Ever. They knew ever since the beginning of our journey. Jeremy and I have always spoken about our shared dream of establishing a modern Yeshivat Shem ve'Ever. Whether we would call it that or not isn't so relevant, but it would be a yeshiva, not only for Israel and the Jewish people, but for all of the nations of the world that can study and strengthen themselves in their understanding and in their faith and in their service of the God of Israel, regardless of where they're coming from. It doesn't matter where you're coming from. What matters is where you're going, where your eyes are looking, where you're gazing, where your heart's desire is. And I think this fellowship is a precursor to that, or maybe this fellowship is Yeshivat Shem ve'Ever just beginning. Either way, really, that's the reason that Yaakov went there, because he really needed to strengthen himself and fortify himself now that he was leaving this cocoon, right, of being raised on Isaac's lap in his tent, absorbing the holiness and the light and witnessing and experience the righteousness and hospitality of his mother, right? Imagine that childhood. Imagine that. Yes, Esau was there and he wasn't such a great guy, but it's clear that they were really living very different and most of the time very much separate lives. But now he had to go into a very different world that, as you can imagine, the yeshiva of Shem and Ever was just the perfect place for him to go. He needed to go there. Why? Because Shem was the son of Noah, right? He was the head of the yeshiva, and he lived in the generation of the flood. And so he knew evil well, and he had experienced levels of evil so intense that the world needed to be destroyed because of it. And the other head of the yeshiva, the other one was Ever, right? And who was Ever? At least vis-a-vis Shem. He was Shem's great grandson. And Ever lived, keep in mind, in those days, we lived so much longer. People lived so much longer that they were able to see their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, their great-great-great-grandchildren. And so they had this yeshiva together. And Ever lived through the building of the Tower of Babel, which the world rebelled against Hashem in their united desire for evil as well. And so what does Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky teach was the reason for this? Like we said, he said that Yaakov went there to learn from these spiritual giants in order to be able to fortify himself and strengthen himself for the spiritually dangerous journey that lay ahead. And so, by the way, this is an ongoing debate in many families within Israel. I'm sure it's happening in America on different levels. And it's happening in the Jewish people today. And it's actually at the root, for example, of the Haredi, Haredi means ultra-Orthodox Jews, with their refusal to join the Israeli army. That's like one of their main political policies, is that they do not have to join the Israeli army. And at least that's what I believe is their reason for not wanting to join the army. What is it? That they're scared that there will be a wide-scale spiritual devastation where all, or at least most, of the many of the yeshiva students who will join the army will just take off their yarmulke, take off their kippah, take off their tzitzit, and leave it all behind. It's like the famous stories that I was raised hearing about these European Jewish immigrants throwing their tefillin, their phylacteries, off the side of the boat as they approached Ellis Island in New York. They were ready to let it all go and to blend in. And I must really respectfully disagree with my ultra-Orthodox brothers because, well, rather than disagree, I would say that if it does happen, that there's this wide-scale spiritual devastation, that they are failing. That if they're even afraid of that happening, they're the ones failing. Because if it is that easy to just pick it all up and throw it all away, it means that the faith of these students going into the army is just too weak and it's too brittle to begin with. I'm telling you, I was in a Hesder yeshiva unit, a unit of yeshiva guys that weren't ultra-Orthodox, but the amount of influence that was coming from these God-fearing Jews in the army was much greater to the secular soldiers than in the reverse. And, you know, there's this debate in the whole country. It's ongoing. You see that there are some yeshuvim, some settlements or cities that are religious, some are secular, and some are mixed. And now I put parentheses around these terms because they don't really apply in Israel. I don't believe in them here. Things just aren't broken down in the same boxes as they are in other places. But I'm using them because it's good enough for the point that I'm trying to make right now. So some people think it's good to raise your children, if you're a religious family, right, to raise religious kids in a mixed city, in a mixed village. And, you know, just to give them the exposure and the opportunity to meet different stripes and different types of Jews. And while at one point I really agreed with that and on an idealistic level and it sounded beautiful to me, throughout my journey, I've come to believe that it's a mistake. That one needs to harness their child's formative years in a protective cocoon-like environment in which they can be imbued with the wisdom and the truth of their heritage and not really have it challenged too much. They're kids, they're not ready to stand up to that. And then once they're built up and educated and taught, then if you've done your job right, you can send them into the world with confidence, right? Send them into the army, send them into these spiritually hostile environments, and they will change those places. It's not those places that will change them. And so if the ultra-Orthodox Haredim would indeed flee their faith and their values the minute they're put to the test, then I would say respectfully and lovingly that the failure is with them. I hope it's good that I'm sharing this with you. I just know how much so many of you love Israel and you want to know the internal dynamics and what's happening. So I just wanted to share that with you. And by the way, if you disagree with me, send me a message and let me know. I'm not like the end all and be all here. I'm just sharing my own opinion here. Anyways, the proof of this point is that Jacob, is in Jacob himself, right? His parents did teach him to be different and to think differently. So Rabbi Aaron Loshak taught this idea beautifully from the incident of the rock over the well. Remember that? They were trying to water their flocks and they couldn't move the rock. So it starts like this. Vayomru lo nuchal ad asher yasfu. We were unable to until all the flocks have been gathered and they will roll the stone off the mouth of the well. Then we will water the flock. So, you know, when the shepherds told him that it would be impossible to move the rock or in order to water the sheep, did Yaakov just adopt and embrace their constraints and their limitations? No. He knew he was different. He was willing to be different and to think differently and start already teaching the world at that point that the limitations that we put on ourselves aren't necessarily real, right? That thinking differently is a good thing, not a bad thing. And I think that the world would actually it would benefit in revisiting this truth today. You know, I'm preparing for a trip abroad and just what I'm encountering from speaking to Jews abroad, it's been a challenging experience. And the truth is, though, that no matter how good a job we may do at raising our children and fortifying them in godly values, there really are no guarantees. We all have stories. We all know there's no guarantees of anything in this world. As a matter of fact, Jeremy shared a new insight that I had actually never heard before. Chapter 31, it starts by saying that Laban's sons were starting to make the same accusations against Jacob that have been made against the Jewish people time and again throughout the entire exile. That Jacob was taking all of their riches and that he made all of his wealth off of them, right, at their expense. And the fact that, of course, like with his arrival, Laban became so many times wealthier by his own admission in the Torah than he did before Jacob arrived. But that wasn't relevant to them. They were just too jealous and they didn't understand basic economics.
As the masks are coming off and much of the world is turning not only against Israel, but yes, against the Jewish people, if you feel different, if your love for Israel is growing deeper and stronger, if you're thirsting to cleave to the nation of Israel and to the God of Israel, if you're thirsting to learn authentic Torah from Jews in Judea, then the Land of Israel Fellowship is for you. Hundreds of individuals and families from around the world come together on Zoom every week in what can only be described as a fellowship of love, friendship, of learning and praying and belonging. A fellowship really unlike any other. It's more than just a movement, it's a family. To learn more about the Land of Israel Fellowship, click on www.thelandofisrael.com/fellowship or send an email to fellowship@thelandofisrael.com. Love and blessings from Judea.